Hi all, this video is going to be a short supplement to the other video that I posted in which Cecilia Munn covers almost all of the fallacies covered in 3.3, and she does a really nice job of systematically laying out when arguments would count as fallacies, when they wouldn't count as fallacies, and breaking down the different types of fallacies in this chapter. She doesn't cover the weak analogy, so I want to talk a little bit about that. I'm also going to talk about some exceptions to the appeal to ignorance. She didn't cover in her video those exceptions, so I want to touch on those briefly. And then I'm going to discuss an example a topical example that's going on as of the time that I'm filming this video, and talk a little bit more about appeals to unqualified authority and hasty generalization with reference to that case study. All right, so let's jump into it. First, let's go down to weak analogy. So the fallacy of weak analogy is committed when the analogy in an analogical argument is not strong enough to support the conclusion drawn. So recall that way back in chapter 2, we talked about arguments by analogy. They're a legitimate form of inductive arguments, so they aim to show that their conclusion is more likely than not. But they can be strong or they can be weak. They all have this form. They compare two entities or two groups of entities. So they say entity A has some attributes, A, B, C, and Z, where those can be filled in. Entity B has attributes A, B, and C. So note the similarities that entity A and entity B have. They share attributes A, B, and C. So then and since A has feature Z, the conclusion is then, well, entity B also has feature Z. So because of the shared similarities A, B, and C, and A has some additional feature Z, we can conclude that B probably has Z as well. Now, so let's fill in an example here. Let's talk about apples. So imagine you pick one apple off the tree, and it's red, shiny, from a particular tree, and delicious. And then you pick another apple, and it's red, shiny, from that same particular tree. Therefore, you could reason that the second apple would also likely be delicious because of those shared similarities. Now, that would be a strong analogical argument. Why? Because there's a causal or systematic relationship between the similarities, on the one hand, and the conclusory features. So the similarities being red, shiny, from the same tree, and the conclusory feature being delicious. So that's what makes it a good analogical argument. If, on the other hand, say we were comparing things like, say the argument went like this: this apple is red and delicious. That door over there is also red, therefore that door over there is also delicious. That would be a weak analogy. Why? Because there isn't that causal relationship just between the redness and the deliciousness. If you throw in from the same tree, if you throw in shiny and they're both fruits, etc., then you'll have a strong analogical argument. But if you just have the quality of redness, well, some red things are delicious, some are not delicious, so you would need more than that to establish the claim. So that would be a weak analogy. All right, the next thing I wanted to cover was the appeal to ignorance. So, Cecilia Munn did a nice job of covering the appeal to ignorance, that there aren't good appeals to ignorance and bad appeals to ignorance. Every appeal to ignorance is a fallacious appeal to ignorance. And the appeal to ignorance occurs when the premises of an argument state that nothing has been proved one way or the other about something, and the conclusion makes a definite assertion about that thing. She gave a nice example of aliens. So nobody has proven that aliens exist, therefore aliens don't exist. That would be an appeal to ignorance, saying nobody's proved something, therefore we know one way or the other. Or to say, or you could have another argument that says nobody's proven that aliens don't exist, therefore aliens exist. That would also be an appeal, a fallacious appeal to ignorance. But there are some exceptions I wanted to cover. One exception that appears like it would be an appeal to ignorance but isn't is when a team of scientists is put together and in an attempt to find evidence for something. And if they don't find evidence for that thing, then there's good reason to believe that that thing does not exist. So imagine a team of researchers, scientists, experts in the field were put together to try to determine if there was life on Mars. They couldn't turn up any evidence. We could conclude that it's likely that there wasn't life on Mars from that argument. Another exception would be in the court of law, you're presumed innocent until you're proven guilty. And that's just a procedural issue. It's the way our justice system works. So the burden of proof is on the prosecution to prove that the defendant is guilty. If they can't prove it, then the defense lawyer could make a good argument that the prosecution has not proven my client guilty, therefore he must be considered innocent. That's the way the procedure works in this country. So note that that argument has the form of an appeal to ignorance. Nothing has been proven, therefore it's not the case. But in the case of criminal trials, that is the way it works. So if you saw on the test a research program trying to find something not turning up evidence, that is good reason to conclude that that thing doesn't exist. So that would not be an appeal to ignorance. And if you saw an example in the court of law where the prosecution has not proved the defendant guilty, therefore he's innocent, that would not be an appeal to ignorance either. That's a legitimate argumentative strategy. Okay, the next thing I want to talk about is I'm going to talk about appeal to ignorance and weak analogy. So again, in the video, Cecilia Munn does a nice job of talking about both appeal to unqualified authority and hasty generalization. They're both fallacies that have their good argument counterparts. So the appeal to unqualified authority has the appeal to qualified authority as the good version of that argument. The hasty generalization has argument by generalization as the good form of that argument. So the difficulty with these, as with so much regarding fallacies, is determining when an argument is an acceptable form, an acceptable version of some form of an argument, and when it's not acceptable. So let me review. The appeal to unqualified authority, it's a variety of the argument from authority and occurs when the cited authority or witness lacks credibility. So then we want to ask the follow-up question, what makes an authority credible? When should we believe them? What makes their word likely? What makes their word such that we should trust it, such that their claims are likely to be true? Well, credible authorities have degrees or publications, or degrees and publications in the relevant field. So they're experts in the field, they have degrees and publications in that field. They're not biased, so there are no conflicts of interest with what they're saying. If we strongly suspect bias, that doesn't mean that their conclusion is definitely wrong. It just means we can't take their word for it, right? So when we're trying to determine if an argument is an appeal to unqualified authority, the question we're asking is, can we just take this person's word for it? Is that strong enough reason to believe that what they're saying is true, or do we have to look at their arguments, right? If an expert gives an argument but they're biased, that doesn't mean they're necessarily wrong. We don't want to commit a fallacy that we learned in the previous, in 3.2, which would be the argument against the person's circumstantial. Even a person with a conflict of interest can give a good argument. We just can't take their word for it. We'd have to evaluate their argument, right? So, credible authorities have degrees and publications in the relevant field. They're not biased, and they agree with the expert consensus, if there is one. If there is an expert consensus, and one of the experts disagrees, say there's a 99% consensus, and then one person disagrees, we can't take that one person's word for it. We would have to evaluate the arguments in that case. So if there's an expert consensus on something, then it's possible that they that we can appeal to authority in a legitimate way. Finally, there are no experts when it comes to politics, morals, and religion. The text Hurley points this out. I want to qualify that a little bit. With regard to politics, there are no experts regarding how you should vote. There are too many arguments on all sorts of sides on that issue. You just have to weigh the arguments yourself. You can't just say, person X says I should vote Y, therefore I should vote Y. Similarly with morality, there are no experts on morality. You might consult people on what's right or wrong, but there are so many disagreements about what makes an action right or wrong, what makes a person good or bad, that we can't just appeal to an authority there. If you take an ethics class, you'll see there's deontological moral theories, utilitarian moral theories, contractarian moral theories, virtue ethical theories, and that's just the start. And there are interesting disagreements between those theories. So you can't just appeal to an authority here. You'd have to look at the arguments. Finally, with religion, there's no authority that you can cite to determine metaphysical questions in religion. For example, whether God exists or not. You can't say the Pope says God exists, therefore God exists. Because there are too many interesting, good arguments on both sides of that question. So you'd have to look at the arguments themselves. There is no expert consensus with regard to these topics, so you just need to consult the arguments and weigh them yourself. Now, that's not to say that there can't be experts in these issues in some narrower ways, like there could be an expert on how a bill gets passed into law. You might consult a professor of constitutional law to see some law professor, and they might know how a bill gets passed into law, and that you could cite them as an expert on that topic. But who you should vote for, you can't. On morality, you could talk to a professor of philosophy whose expertise is in ethics, and they could tell you how a moral system works. They could be an expert on that topic, and you could cite them as they'd be a qualified authority on that topic. Similarly, you could ask the Pope, hey, how does somebody become a cardinal? And he'll tell you, how do they become a cardinal? And he would be an expert on that topic. So within these domains, there can be expertise on some questions, just not on the big questions. All right, so there's unqualified authority. Now let's jump over to hasty generalization. Recall that a hasty generalization occurs when there's a reasonable likelihood that the sample is not representative of the group in an argument by generalization. So all arguments by generalization, they say some group has some quality, or some sample some sample of a larger group has some quality. That's the premise. And then the conclusion is, so, therefore, the larger group also has that quality, whatever the quality is. Now, how good the argument is will depend on how large and representative the sample is of the general population. So good samples are sufficiently large and sufficiently diverse, whatever, and that criteria can change depending on what we're looking at. But what I want to talk about specifically is something that's recently come up and that shows how important it is to be really careful about who counts as a qualified authority and what counts as a good generalization versus a hasty generalization. So the topic that I want to talk about is this. So recently, as of when I'm filming this, 2 doctors came out with claims saying that it was safe for California to open up again, that coronavirus wasn't a threat sufficient to have the shelter-in-place orders, and that we could lift them. So I'm going to read this article. A news conference by 2 California doctors that downplayed the threat of the coronavirus and made dubious claims that the disease had already spread widely and therefore was not dangerous struck a chord with those itching for states to ease stay-at-home orders, but is being condemned by public health officials and experts. Now, let me pause right here. Recall in the videos, Cecilia Munn gives the example of consulting your Aunt Sally about some medical problem and then constructing an argument. Well, Aunt Sally says X, therefore X is the case, where Aunt Sally is not a medical expert. And then consulting your doctor, where your doctor is a medical expert. Say you were wondering about a rash and you were consulting a skin doctor. What am I looking for? Anyways, whatever the skin doctor would be. That would be their area of expertise. So you could go on, you could say, well, they identified the rash as a staph infection, therefore it's likely a staph infection, right? That would be an appropriate appeal to authority. So we might think that 2 doctors gave a press conference in which they said that the coronavirus was not sufficiently dangerous to warrant the stay-at-home orders. So we might think, well, we can appeal to their authority as doctors, right? But note some things were already given in this article. Their judgment here is being condemned by public health officials and experts. So recall when we were talking about what makes a qualified authority. Qualified authorities have degrees and publications in the relevant field. Now, we might say that they're doctors, so maybe they work, and they certainly have degrees in to be able to practice medicine. They probably have publications to be able to practice medicine. What we might wonder about is whether these degrees or publications are in the relevant field. So they are doctors, but do they specialize in infectious disease? In other words, are they epidemiologists? If they are, then we could we could check this box here. If they're not, then their degree and publications are not in the relevant field. The field is too broad, and they're making a statement specifically about an infectious disease. So we'd want to make sure that their expertise is in this area. Or if it's in public health, that would also be a relevant, a more relevant field here. Now, the second thing we have to look at is bias. Are they biased in any way? Well, let's keep reading. A widely shared local television video of last week's news conference, which was posted on YouTube, reached more than 5 million views and was amplified by Elon Musk and Fox News, where Dr. Erickson and Dr. Masihi appeared on primetime shows 2 nights in a row. It's been taken down. The doctors, who are not epidemiologists and who own and operate urgent care centers in Bakersfield, held the news conference. Let's go back. So they're not epidemiologists, they're not public health officials, so they have degrees and probably publications, but whether the field is relevant, it's not relevant enough. Who we want to trust here are epidemiologists and public health officials. Are they biased? Do they have conflicts of interest? Yes, they do have a conflict of interest. They run urgent cares, so they want more people to be out. They, well, it would be in their financial interest if more people were visiting the urgent cares. So that's problematic. They might also have vested interests in other ways in making these claims. So are they biased? Do they have conflicts of interest? It might be that they have conflicts of interest. Third, do they agree with the expert consensus? So let's keep reading. So they there was widespread condemnation from health officials and medical experts. There's a lot to object to from a scientific point of view, Andrew Neumer, an epidemiologist, told CNN. He said one big problem is that doctors made estimates based on their clinic's clients who were tested, not a sampling of the general population, which leads us to the hasty generalization talk. But what these doctors are doing is corrupting the process from the start to make it seem like they are doing an honest policy analysis, added Neumer, who's an associate professor of population health and disease prevention at the University of California, Irvine. There's an expert in a more relevant field. The video also prompted the American College of Emergency Physicians and American Academy of Emergency Medicine to issue a forceful joint statement on Monday calling the pair's claims reckless and untested musings that are inconsistent with current science and epidemiology regarding COVID-19. As owners of local urgent care clinics, it appears these two individuals are releasing biased, non-peer-reviewed data to advance their personal financial interests without regard for the public's health. So, they're not passing any of these tests. They have degrees and publications, not in the more narrowly relevant field. They do exhibit signs of conflicts of interest. They do not agree with the expert consensus. So if somebody were to produce an argument saying these two doctors say that coronavirus is not sufficiently dangerous to warrant our current stay-at-home, shelter-in-place orders, therefore, it's not dangerous enough to warrant those orders, considering that they're doctors, well, that would be an appeal to unqualified authority in this case. So you see, it's really tricky to figure out who counts as a qualified authority and who doesn't. But this is a nice checklist to see if somebody does. Now, let's go back to hasty generalization. No, good samples are sufficiently large and sufficiently diverse. So up here, the doctors who are not epidemiologists and who own and operate urgent care centers held the news conference on April 22nd to share their conclusions about the results of 5,213 coronavirus tests at their clinics, extrapolating their findings to the California population as a whole. Now, they're making claims based on 5,000 people, over 5,000 people. That seems like a sufficiently large sample. Is it sufficiently diverse? Well, the issue is their clinics are just in the Bakersfield area. Furthermore, they're urgent care centers, so the sample size that they might be getting could be those who think that they're sick enough to go to urgent care but not sick enough to go directly to the hospital, right? So is their sample sufficiently large? Well, 5,000 might be a sufficiently large enough sample. However, is it sufficiently diverse? No, they're all people who came to their clinics in a particular area of California to draw the conclusions that they're drawing. If they were drawing conclusions about California, you would want people from all over California who are checking into urgent cares, who are checking into hospitals, etc., etc. So, and if they're making conclusions about the country at large or the world, then they're going to need even more diverse samples from all over the world. All right, so hopefully that makes it clear that, well, first of all, hopefully I explained the weak analogy fallacy in a way that makes sense. Second, I hope I explained well sufficiently the exceptions to appeal to ignorance. Finally, I wanted to demonstrate that discussions of fallacious reasoning are really just the beginning of bigger conversations about arguments, and it's difficult to determine whether or not something is a fallacy or is not a fallacy, and that sometimes takes some digging into. And I hope I demonstrated that with the talk about the two doctors in Bakersfield and their claims, and why people might be appealing to unqualified authority when they appeal to those claims, and how the doctors themselves might be committing hasty generalizations. All right, so the quiz for this week won't come from this video. You'll just take the quiz maybe after you've watched these lectures and after you've done the homework, and then you can take the quiz, and hopefully you've absorbed the material by then. You won't have the questions ahead of time, but if you've absorbed the material, you should be able to identify the fallacies there. Thanks for sticking with me and watching, and I'll see you next time.